Vienna, winter of 1618. Inside the freezing halls of the Hofburg Palace, an empress lay dying at just 33. Her name was Anna of Tyrol, a Habsburg bride sacrificed to ceremony, duty, and silence. No children, no legacy, only exhaustion carved into her fragile body. As the empire teetered on the edge of war, her death passed quietly, swallowed by the shadows of history. She was born in Innsbruck on October 4th, 1585. A daughter of Tyrol, a child of the mountains, but raised not by nature's gentleness, rather by the iron hand of religion. Anna of Tyrol entered the world already burdened with expectation. Her father, Archduke Ferdinand II of Austria, ruled over Tyrol and further Austria, a man of power yet bound himself by Catholic faith and politics. Her mother, Anna Caterina Gonzaga, descended from the Mantuan Gonzagas and carried within her the legacy of Spain's Francis Borgia, a saint whose shadow seemed to hover over the household. From the moment she learned to walk, Anna's world was heavy with crucifixes, prayers, and the echo of sermons. Childhood in Innsbruck was not playful. While other children might laugh in gardens or chase the brightness of spring, Anna's days were steeped in the rituals of piety. Hours were given to kneeling, to whispered prayers that stretched long into evenings, lit by the flickering glow of candles. She was taught to measure herself not by joy, but by silence, by discipline, by obedience. Her tutors drilled into her Latin psalms, catechism, the weight of Catholic identity. The Counter-Reformation was raging across Europe. For a Habsburg daughter, her very existence was to be a soldier in that spiritual war, though not with sword, but with submission. She grew delicate, pale, with eyes that often looked beyond the room, as though trained to gaze inward. Her health was never robust. Weak lungs, frequent coughing, a body that betrayed her even in childhood. But the court did not soften. Illness was treated as a test of faith. Each fever, each fainting spell, became an invitation to offer suffering to God. Anna internalized that lesson. Pain was no longer an enemy. It was her inheritance. As she matured, her devotion deepened. Witnesses spoke of her austerity, her seriousness. She wore jewels as duty demanded, but her gaze rarely lingered on them. Music and feasts stirred little excitement in her. Instead, she gravitated to chapels, to convents, to the cloistered corners where incense burned heavy and shadows seemed eternal. The Gonzaga blood in her tied her to Mantua, to Italy, to a Catholic world that never ceased to tighten its grip as Protestant fires spread north. Anna's upbringing was thus both shield and chain. Shield, for she was admired by churchmen as an example of piety, the kind of woman to strengthen dynastic alliances. Chain, for her life was already pre-written. Marriage would not be hers to choose. Her womb, her breath, her very presence would be bartered for the empire. Her mother, Anna Caterina, a widow early, had herself embraced religious life after Ferdinand's death. The lesson to the daughter was unmistakable. Devotion was destiny. Whether as wife or nun, Anna of Tyrol would never escape the iron walls of Catholic obligation. In her youth, she watched processions. Grand altars, gilded reliquaries, holy relics borne on velvet. She saw the contrast between grandeur and frailty, gold chalices in priestly hands, while her own hands trembled from weakness. It must have left an imprint, a realization that in the Habsburg world, beauty was not freedom but ornament, placed around a life already pledged to service. By the late 1590s, her name appeared in dynastic discussions. The Habsburg family spread across Europe like a web, tying Spain, Austria, Italy, and the Low Countries together. Every princess was a piece on the chessboard. Anna was no exception. Her delicate health did not remove her from this calculation. If anything, her reputation for devoutness made her attractive to factions who wanted a queen consort that embodied Catholic virtue. She was trained not for affection, not for joy, but for sacrifice. When her father died in 1595, Anna was only 10. It marked a fracture in her life. The court grew quieter, more austere, under the influence of her mother's widowhood and increasing religiosity. The atmosphere of Innsbruck turned even more cloister-like. For Anna, childhood dissolved early into the solemn responsibilities of a woman expected to carry an empire's faith on her shoulders. Letters from contemporaries describe her as serious, reserved, almost cold. But beneath that reserve lay a body constantly at war with itself. Fits of coughing, fevers in winter, fragility that followed her like a shadow. In the Habsburg Chronicles, her youth is remembered less for liveliness than for endurance. She learned how to endure long hours of prayer, how to endure ritual without faltering, how to endure her own weakness without complaint. The Jesuit influence was strong in her upbringing. They preached that rulers and their spouses must embody the militant Catholic identity of the Counter-Reformation. Anna absorbed this not merely as ideology, but as her only identity. She was never allowed to be simply Anna. She was always Anna of Tyrol, daughter of Ferdinand, child of Gonzaga blood, a vessel for dynastic holiness. As adolescence ended, whispers of marriage negotiations increased. Would she be sent to Italy? To Spain? To join another Habsburg cousin? Her own desires are absent from the record, and perhaps from her own heart. She was molded to erase desire. The crown would be chosen for her, and she would wear it, even if it weighed more than she could bear. By the dawn of the 17th century, Anna of Tyrol had become a symbol before she became a bride. A woman marked not by laughter or youth, but by devotion and fragility. The world would soon decide her fate, and it would not be merciful. The year was 1611. Anna of Tyrol was 26. No longer the fragile child of Innsbruck, yet still wrapped in the aura of devout silence that had defined her entire youth. Europe was trembling. The Habsburg dynasty, vast but fracturing, was desperate to hold its dominion together. Religion was tearing nations apart, Protestants and Catholics clashing in every court, every city, every village. Within this turmoil, marriages were no longer personal. They were weapons. And Anna's hand became one such weapon. Her husband-to-be was Matthias, Archduke of Austria, then elected Holy Roman Emperor. He was nearly 30 years older, a man hardened by decades of politics, rebellions, and endless negotiation. He had no heirs. He needed an empress who could bring not only loyalty, but also legitimacy to his weakening rule. Anna of Tyrol, with her Gonzaga blood and her reputation for iron piety, seemed a perfect answer. The match was arranged swiftly, almost clinically. There were no recorded courtships, no tender exchanges. Instead, it was a transaction. One dynasty's daughter to reinforce another dynasty's crown. The Habsburgs had long practiced such unions, but for Anna the weight was doubled. She was not merely marrying Matthias. She was marrying the empire's expectations, the empire's fears, the empire's desperate grasp for stability. On the day of their wedding in 1611, grandeur veiled the absence of intimacy. The ceremonies unfolded in Vienna with pomp. Golden chalices raised, choirs filling the air with sacred music, courtiers dressed in splendor. Yet beneath the veils and the jewels, Anna's fate was sealed in silence. She stood beside Matthias, not as a partner of equal hope, but as an emblem. She would be the Holy Roman Empress. She would be Queen of Hungary, Queen of Bohemia. Yet within all those titles, she remained voiceless. Accounts of the marriage describe Anna as dutiful. She performed the gestures required, her composure unbroken. But the private reality was harsher. Their union was not warm. Matthias, already aging, carried the fatigue of battles and political crises. Anna, bound by her devotion, responded not with affection, but with discipline. She retreated further into religion, into rituals, into ceremonies that consumed her fragile body. No children came. Each year passed without an heir. In the Habsburg courts, where fertility was political currency, Anna's empty cradle became a silent scandal. The whispers grew. Was she barren? Was Matthias too old? No one dared speak openly, but everyone noticed. Without heirs, their marriage was both fragile and futile in the eyes of dynastic politics. Anna, who had been raised to believe suffering was a duty, bore this burden without complaint. But the weight gnawed at her, eroding what little joy marriage might have offered. Yet Anna did leave one enduring mark with Matthias. Together, they founded the Klosterneuburg Monastery, a religious house near Vienna. It was not a palace of pleasure or a fortress of war, but a sanctuary of devotion. For Anna, this act carried symbolic weight. If she could not give her husband a child, she would give him a monument to faith. A house of God, carved in stone where their names would endure. Life in the imperial court, however, did not soften. The rituals were endless. Coronations in Hungary and Bohemia demanded her presence. Festivals, processions, liturgies, each one pressing Anna deeper into the rigid machinery of Habsburg power. She became known for her severity, not playful, not indulgent, but stern, disciplined, unyielding. Courtiers respected her, but did not love her. She was an empress of distance, a figure carved from marble rather than flesh. Behind closed doors, her health faltered. The winters of Vienna were harsh. The palaces were cold, damp, heavy with drafts. Her weak lungs suffered. Each ceremonial duty she fulfilled took another measure of strength away. Witnesses recalled her pale complexion, her frequent coughing, the way her body seemed unable to keep pace with the heavy robes she was forced to wear. But stepping back was never an option. The Empress was expected to appear, to embody the dignity of the empire, no matter the toll. It was during these years that Anna's identity fully dissolved into her role. The girl of Tyrol had vanished. In her place stood an empress bound by titles and rituals, drained of her own voice. She had been raised to surrender, and now she lived in surrender. Only the monastery at Klosterneuburg bore witness to the fragments of her private faith, her attempt to shape her suffering into something lasting. For Matthias, Anna's presence brought stability to his reign, at least outwardly. He could present a devout, legitimate empress beside him. But the reality of their marriage, childless, cold, burdened by duty, was one of absence. They were two lives intersecting in necessity, not in love. And yet, history remembers her less than it remembers him. Even in their lifetime, Matthias's decisions, his struggles with Bohemia and Hungary, his looming conflicts with Ferdinand II, overshadowed Anna's quiet endurance. She was present at every ceremony, every public moment, yet she was invisible. Her political marriage was never meant to give her freedom. It was meant to erase her, to fold her entirely into the empire. And it succeeded. But in the shadows of those halls, behind the processions and crowns, her body was already breaking. The weight of her role was not only emotional, it was physical. Each ritual demanded standing, kneeling, traveling, in bitter winters that tore at her lungs. The political marriage that gave her crowns was the very marriage that condemned her to an early grave. The Hofburg Palace glittered with ceremony. Every week, sometimes every day, demanded another ritual. Processions wound through Vienna's streets. Altars blazed with candles. Trumpets rang out in echoing halls. For the court, these ceremonies were a display of power. For Anna of Tyrol, they were a slow and relentless trial. She was expected to embody dignity, to sit or stand for hours beneath the heavy weight of brocade gowns and jeweled crowns. Each garment pressed against her frail body like armor. Her lungs, already weak since childhood, struggled with the cold air that seeped through stone walls. She coughed, quietly, covering her lips with silken handkerchiefs. But still she rose, still she walked the endless corridors, still she bowed before relics and altars. The empire demanded visibility. The Empress could not retreat. At coronations in Hungary and Bohemia, Anna appeared beside Matthias. Veiled in solemnity, she was paraded through cathedrals, her every gesture scrutinized, her very body turned into a public icon of Catholic devotion. It did not matter if her steps faltered. It did not matter if fever burned beneath her skin. The ritual had to continue. Contemporaries noted her severity. A woman who allowed no levity at court. In truth, her sternness was partly a mask, a shield against the exhaustion devouring her. If she let her guard slip, even once, the whispers would sharpen. Already courtiers murmured about her failure to produce an heir. To appear weak, to admit suffering, would only deepen her irrelevance. So she doubled down. She performed each duty with rigid precision, a living statue in lace and jewels. The irony was brutal. Anna's devotion to ritual was genuine. From her childhood, she had embraced Catholic piety as her calling. Yet the very rituals she revered now consumed her. Each festival, each litany, each season of Lent or Advent demanded more of her failing body. Where prayer had once been solace, now it became a chain. The winters of Vienna were cruel. The palace was vast, but draft-ridden. Fires smoked, yet the cold seeped through. During Epiphany, during Holy Week, during Christmas vigils, Anna remained at Matthias's side. She knelt on stone floors for hours, even as chills racked her spine. Priests droned, incense thickened the air. Courtiers watched. Her body broke down silently beneath the solemn surface. There were moments when she collapsed after ceremonies. Attendants whispered of coughing fits that left blood on her linen. The symptoms were clear. Tuberculosis, the consumption that claimed so many Habsburg lives. But medicine offered little. Physicians prescribed broths, herbs, rest. Rest was impossible. The empire required her presence, and her own piety forbade retreat. Every duty reinforced her invisibility. While Matthias struggled with rebellious nobles and restless estates, Anna became the silent partner of his reign. She attended mass after mass, feast after feast. She founded monasteries, donated relics, funded churches. Yet each act seemed less like legacy, more like self-erasure. Her life dissolved into ritual until no line remained between faith and sacrifice. The courtiers remembered her less as a woman than as a symbol. Severe, cold, disciplined. They saw only the surface, not the frailty beneath. They did not see the long nights when she lay awake, shivering, her breath shallow, her lungs straining. They did not hear the muffled sobs of attendants when her coughing echoed through chambers. The paradox was stark. Anna's devotion made her admirable, but also expendable. She was praised for her piety, Yet the same piety allowed her suffering to be ignored. An heirless empress, exhausted, fading, and still expected to kneel at dawn. Vienna itself seemed complicit. The city was alive with Catholic triumphalism. Chapels gleamed, processions filled the streets, bells rang ceaselessly. Anna became another bell, another relic, another token of faith. She was not seen as fragile flesh, but as part of the machinery of ceremony. And all the while, her body was failing. Each winter deepened her decline. Each ritual scraped away another fragment of her strength. She endured, as she always had. But endurance has its limits. By 1618, whispers grew louder. The Empress was ill. She was seen coughing violently during a feast. She was pale, thin, her gowns hanging loosely. Still she appeared. Still she prayed. Those closest to her knew the truth. She was being consumed, not only by disease, but by duty. The rituals of empire had become her undoing. Faith, once her refuge, was now indistinguishable from torment. Every bow, every kneel, every procession was another step toward the grave. Anna of Tyrol was not merely dying of tuberculosis, she was dying of exhaustion, sanctified as devotion. By the winter of 1617, her body was no longer able to disguise its decline. The Empress, who had once stood firm in ceremonies, now struggled simply to walk the palace corridors. Her face, once pale but steady, grew gaunt. Her lips carried the faint stain of blood. Each cough shook her frame with a violence that startled her attendants. Anna of Tyrol had always been fragile. But now her fragility had become a spectacle. Courtiers whispered of the ailing Empress. Physicians circled her chambers, murmuring prescriptions of tonics and elixirs. None of it mattered. Tuberculosis was a slow, merciless predator, and Anna was its captive. Still, duty did not release her. In 1617, the empire staged ceremonies that demanded her presence. Matthias was faltering as ruler. He leaned on ritual to mask weakness, and Anna, despite her illness, was required at his side. She appeared at feasts where the air reeked of roasted meats she could not eat. She knelt in cathedrals where incense choked her already starved lungs. She stood for hours while her body trembled beneath the weight of velvet gowns. Witnesses noted that her eyes seemed sunken, her complexion almost translucent. Yet she maintained composure. No grimace, no protest. The silence of her suffering became its own kind of performance. The Empress was dying in plain sight, yet no one dared name it. In private, the collapse was unmistakable. Nights were restless, broken by fits of coughing that left bloodied cloths hidden in the shadows. Attendants spoke of the chill that clung to her even in heated chambers, the fever that rose without warning, the exhaustion that left her unable to lift her head. She could no longer climb stairs without assistance. Yet when dawn came, she dressed again in jewels and veils, a queen fashioned out of pain. Matthias, older and already weary, could offer little comfort. Their marriage, cold and political from the start, had no reservoir of tenderness to draw upon. He saw her decline but did not, perhaps could not, intervene. The emperor had his own struggles. Rebellious estates, looming conflict in Bohemia, the threat of Ferdinand II's rise. Anna became another burden he endured quietly, her collapse overshadowed by the empire's collapse. Her piety, once a strength, turned into a trap. She refused to withdraw from religious obligations. If there was mass, she would attend. If there was a procession, she would appear. To step away was unthinkable, for she had been raised to equate suffering with holiness. Each cough, each fever, she interpreted as another chance to serve God. What the court saw as weakness, she saw as sacrifice. And so she continued, even as her body begged for rest. The toll became visible in her movements. During a great liturgy in Vienna, she nearly collapsed while kneeling. 2 attendants caught her before she fell, disguising the stumble as a bow. At another feast, she was seen leaving early, her face hidden behind a veil. Rumors spread of her imminent death, yet months dragged on. Tuberculosis did not strike swiftly. It consumed inch by inch. By 1618, her condition had reached its breaking point. That year, the empire itself trembled. In Prague, Protestant nobles threw Catholic officials out of a castle window, the defenestration that ignited the 30 Years' War. Europe was sliding into one of its bloodiest conflicts. Against that backdrop, Anna's illness seemed a footnote, an afterthought. But for those near her, it was the central tragedy. She spent much of that year confined to chambers, curtains drawn against the winter drafts. Her attendants noted the smell of sickness in the air, the heavy, sweet scent of decay that clung to her breath. She wasted away, her gowns needing to be altered as her body shrank. Her voice grew faint, often no more than a whisper. And yet, even in her last months, she remained bound to ceremony. On feast days, she insisted on attending Mass, carried on a chair when she could no longer walk. Witnesses described her as spectral, a queen who looked like a shadow of herself, lips pale, eyes hollow, but still veiled in imperial dignity. The collapse of her health mirrored the collapse of her significance. She had given the empire no heir. She had left no strong political imprint. Her death would not alter the dynasty's trajectory, at least not in the eyes of the court. And so her suffering unfolded quietly, barely chronicled, almost invisible. Anna of Tyrol, Empress at 26, was now a withered figure at 33, consumed not only by disease, but by the empire's indifference. Her collapse was both physical and symbolic. She had been raised to embody devotion, to give herself entirely to ritual. Now, with her body breaking, she realized devotion had taken everything: her youth, her health, her future. The winter deepened. Vienna's air grew colder. The coughs grew harsher. The fevers unrelenting. Her attendants prayed by her bedside, candles flickering against stone walls. But even prayer seemed powerless. The Empress was fading. The collapse of her health was no sudden tragedy. It was the slow unraveling of a woman who had been asked to give too much, too early, too constantly. And the end was near. Vienna, December 1618. The city was wrapped in snow, its streets muffled under a white silence. But inside the Habsburg palace, silence carried a different weight. It was the silence of a life ebbing away. Anna of Tyrol lay in her chamber, her breath ragged, each inhalation a battle. Curtains were drawn against the cold, yet drafts crept through stone walls. The room smelled of smoke, wax, and illness. Candles flickered nervously, their flames bending with every whisper of wind. Attendants moved softly, their faces etched with helplessness. She was only 33, but her body was already ancient with suffering. Her cheeks hollowed, her frame reduced to frail bones wrapped in fabric. She clutched a crucifix in her thin hands, fingers trembling. To those who looked upon her, she resembled less a queen than a relic, a symbol of devotion, burned down to ash. Tuberculosis had done its work. Weeks of fever had left her too weak to rise, too weak even to sit upright. Blood stained her handkerchiefs, hidden quickly by servants who feared the sight might disturb her dignity. Each cough tore through her chest with the violence of a final judgment. The disease consumed her from within, as relentless as the empire's demands had been from without. Yet even in those last days, ritual did not release her. Priests came daily, filling the room with Latin prayers, their chants circling the ceiling like mournful echoes. Incense burned thick, clashing with the smell of sickness. Anna whispered her responses, lips barely moving, voice thin as smoke. She believed, perhaps with desperation, that each prayer might redeem her pain, transform her exhaustion into something eternal. Matthias visited her chamber, though his own health was faltering. He was 61, an emperor nearing his end as well. He stood at her bedside, watching the wife he had married for politics, now reduced to a shadow of herself. There was no record of tenderness, no gestures of comfort. He watched, as emperors do, with the distance of one accustomed to loss. Anna did not ask for more. She had never asked for anything. Outside her chamber, Europe convulsed. The defenestration of Prague had already ignited rebellion. Armies stirred. The empire teetered on the edge of the 30 Years' War. In that chaos, Anna's decline passed with little notice. Her life was being extinguished in the same silence that had defined it, overshadowed by politics, erased by history's larger tragedies. On December 14th, the struggle ended. Anna's breath slowed to shallow gasps. Priests gathered, chanting the litany of the saints. Attendants wept quietly in corners. She pressed the crucifix to her lips one last time. Her eyes closed, her face serene, though marked by exhaustion so deep it seemed carved into bone. At the final moment, the room grew still. The chants faltered. The Empress was gone. There was no spectacle in her death. No grand farewell, no public grief. She died quietly, surrounded not by crowds but by a handful of attendants and clerics. For all the years she had been paraded before the empire, her final act was hidden. A queen who had embodied ritual in life was granted only silence in death. Her body was prepared with solemn care, veils placed, jewels arranged, candles lit. She was carried to Klosterneuburg Monastery, the very foundation she and Matthias had created. It was there, beneath vaulted ceilings and cold stone, that she was entombed. A monument of faith, perhaps the only child she and Matthias had together. The empire barely paused. Matthias himself would die less than a year later. In 1619, the succession passed to Ferdinand II, and Europe plunged fully into war. Anna's name slipped quickly into obscurity, her brief reign buried under decades of bloodshed. But for those who had seen her in those last weeks, the memory lingered. The sight of an empress coughing blood into silk, the sound of her whispered prayers fighting against silence, the image of her small, trembling frame beneath the weight of crowns too heavy for her fragile body. Anna of Tyrol died as she had lived, obedient, devout, consumed by duty, erased by history. Her death was not a catastrophe for the empire. It was not a turning point in politics. It was simply the quiet end of a woman who had given everything, her health, her youth, her very breath, to the rituals of a court that demanded her life without ever truly remembering it. And in that lies the cruelest truth. The Empress was forgotten before the candles on her coffin had even burned out. The bells of Vienna tolled for the Empress in December 1618. But their echoes faded quickly, drowned beneath the rising noise of war. Anna of Tyrol, dead at 33, was buried with solemn rites in Klosterneuburg Monastery. The marble and candles gave her death a proper dignity. Yet even as her body lay in stone silence, the empire was already turning its gaze elsewhere. Europe was burning. The defenestration of Prague had split the fragile balance of the Holy Roman Empire, and the 30 Years' War had begun. History has a brutal instinct for forgetting those who leave no heirs. Anna bore no children. No dynasty traced itself back to her womb. No succession debates invoked her name. Without a son or daughter to carry her memory into the next generation, her presence in the Habsburg saga dissolved almost overnight. Matthias himself lived barely a year after her. His death in 1619 shifted power to Ferdinand II, the architect of the Catholic Counter-Reformation's fiercest campaigns. With him came new wars, new policies, new tragedies. Against such upheavals, Anna's story became irrelevant, a faint footnote buried under decades of blood and fire. In chronicles of the time, her name is scarcely mentioned. Matthias appears, yes, as emperor, as ruler during the first sparks of the 30 Years' War. But Anna? She is remembered only in passing, as the pious consort, a woman devout but childless, her life reduced to a single adjective. Even the monastery she helped found, Klosterneuburg, was quickly associated more with Matthias's legacy than her own. The Empress herself blurred into obscurity. This erasure was not accidental. It was systemic. In the Habsburg world, a queen consort's worth was measured by her ability to produce heirs and to reinforce dynastic politics. Anna had fulfilled neither. Her devotion, her piety, her ceaseless endurance of ritual, all counted for little once her body lay in the ground. She had been an instrument of ceremony, and when ceremony ended, she was set aside. The irony is painful. Anna's entire existence was dedicated to remembrance, to founding monasteries, to preserving Catholic faith through ritual, to embodying a dynasty's spiritual armor. Yet she herself was not remembered. Her name carried no resonance beyond the walls of the monastery she built. Her image faded from court portraits. Her life, so consumed by duty, became a shadow too faint to notice. For contemporaries, the silence was deliberate. Courtiers preferred not to dwell on an empress who symbolized failure. No heirs, no lasting political influence, no triumphant legacy. Chroniclers, focused on war and rebellion, found little space for the story of a young woman who coughed herself to death in palace chambers. Priests praised her piety, but only in brief, formulaic words, nothing more. Even in death, ritual swallowed her. Her funeral, grand in form, was one of many imperial ceremonies. Soon afterward, the empire turned to coronations, councils, campaigns. The Empress became a forgotten candle in the procession of history. The brutality of her erasure can be glimpsed in how little remains. No intimate diaries, no heartfelt letters, few portraits. Even her tomb, shared with Matthias at Klosterneuburg, is less a personal monument than a dynastic display. She is there, yes, but only as part of a double burial, her presence overshadowed by her husband's title. The 30 Years' War ensured her memory was buried deeper still. What was one woman's quiet suffering compared to armies burning cities, villages massacred, kingdoms overturned? Historians looked back and saw only blood, politics, shifting alliances. Anna's life, fragile, devout, consumed, became invisible. Yet her fate was not unique. She joined the silent company of Habsburg consorts erased by time. Queens without heirs, empresses without power, women whose lives were folded into dynastic machinery and then discarded. They existed to perform, to embody faith and duty, and then to vanish. Anna of Tyrol was simply one of the clearest examples, her short life distilled into nothing more than a forgotten end. But invisibility does not mean insignificance. The very act of her erasure reveals the cruelty of power. An empress who gave her body to ritual, who poured her fragile health into sustaining an empire's faith, was deemed irrelevant the moment she died. Her story is not only about absence, but about what absence itself tells us. That behind the monuments and the wars, there were human lives consumed, then silenced. The empire moved forward without her. War engulfed Europe. Matthias vanished. Ferdinand II rose. The Habsburg line survived. And Anna of Tyrol, who had once walked at the very heart of that empire, was swallowed by silence, forgotten, erased. A queen who became nothing more than a shadow in the cold corridors of history. In the quiet town of Klosterneuburg, just north of Vienna, stands a monastery whose stones carry Anna of Tyrol's only enduring voice. It was here, in 1614, that she and her husband Matthias laid the foundations of a religious sanctuary meant to outlast them both. The decision to establish Klosterneuburg Monastery was more than an act of devotion. It was also a gesture of legacy. For Matthias, aging and airless, the monastery was a way to inscribe his name into eternity. For Anna, fragile and childless, it was a way to transform her suffering into permanence. If she could not pass life through her body, she would pass memory through stone. The monastery was envisioned as a grand Augustinian house, a place of worship, ritual, and continuity. It embodied the Habsburg obsession with fusing power and piety. Gold chalices, ornate vestments, relics of saints. All these were meant to radiate authority through faith. But beneath that grandeur lay a more intimate truth. Klosterneuburg was Anna's surrogate child. Records suggest Anna took an active interest in its foundation. Though her health weakened with each year, she insisted on shaping the monastery's role, ensuring it would stand as a bulwark of Catholic identity at a time when Protestant challenges threatened the empire. It was her way of proving that she, too, could leave something behind. Something more than silence. After her death, Anna was buried there alongside Matthias. The tomb is impressive. Marble, gilded ornament, solemn inscriptions. Visitors walking its halls today see a dynastic statement, a monument to a ruling couple who anchored their faith in stone. Yet if one looks closely, the tomb reveals something more haunting. It is less about Anna than about the empire. Her name is carved, yes, but her presence is overshadowed by titles, by Matthias's imperial stature, by the grandeur of Habsburg propaganda. And yet, the monastery itself carries whispers of her. Within its cloisters, the rhythm of prayer continues centuries after her final breath. Each chant, each lit candle becomes an echo of the devotion she embodied. In that sense, Klosterneuburg fulfills the promise she may have hoped for, to endure, even when memory failed her. Still, her legacy is fragile. Unlike Habsburg rulers who left heirs or built palaces brimming with symbolism, Anna's name rarely appears in histories of art or politics. The monastery is remembered as Matthias's project. The tomb is seen as part of imperial ritual. The woman behind it, the Empress who poured her remaining strength into ensuring its foundation, is rarely given recognition. There is a paradox in her legacy. She is both present and absent. Present in stone, in cloisters, in rituals that continue. Absent in narrative, in textbooks, in cultural memory. Klosterneuburg bears her fingerprint, but history has blurred it almost to invisibility. For those who pause, however, Anna's shadow lingers. The monastery's heavy walls, built to withstand centuries, stand in contrast to the frailty of the woman who conceived them. They symbolize permanence, while her own body dissolved at 33. They stand tall, while she lay wasted in bed, coughing blood. They are her defiance against the silence of history, her whispered refusal to vanish completely. It is here, perhaps, that one can read her truest legacy, not in political triumphs or dynastic heirs, but in endurance. Anna's life was defined by fragility, yet she forced that fragility into a monument that still stands. She did not conquer, she did not rule, she did not change the course of empire, but she left behind a space of prayer, a space of faith, a space that still remembers even when people forget. Modern historians sometimes rediscover her in footnotes, noting her role in the monastery's foundation. Yet the tone remains distant, almost dismissive. Pious consort, devout empress. The same words repeated, reducing a lifetime of sacrifice to a phrase. Still, the monastery itself resists that reduction. It insists silently that she mattered. The irony is that Anna's only true act of agency came through devotion, the very devotion that had consumed her. In creating Klosterneuburg, she weaponized her piety, turning it into stone and ritual that survived centuries. Perhaps this was her unspoken rebellion. If history would forget her life, it could not erase her prayer. And so her legacy lingers in shadow. Not in the light of fame, not in the brilliance of remembered queens, but in the dim cloisters of a monastery where candles still burn. The forgotten empress remains, if not in name, then in silence, in prayer, in the echo of footsteps on stone. It is a fragile legacy, but it is hers. When Anna of Tyrol died in December 1618, Europe was already tilting into chaos. Barely 6 months earlier, in Prague, Protestant nobles had hurled 2 Catholic officials from the windows of a castle, the defenestration that ignited rebellion across Bohemia. It was the spark that lit one of the longest, bloodiest wars in European history. The 30 Years' War did not pause for a queen's funeral. Armies marched, alliances fractured, towns burned. And amid this storm, Anna's death became a whisper no one could hear. Her husband, Emperor Matthias, still sat on the throne, but his reign was crumbling. He had no heir. The Habsburg dynasty's future rested on Ferdinand of Styria, soon to become Ferdinand II, a figure determined to crush Protestant opposition with relentless force. The empire's focus shifted instantly from mourning to survival. In such a moment, the empress's passing, an empress without children, without political influence, seemed irrelevant. Chroniclers recorded her death briefly, almost clinically. Anna, Empress, wife of Matthias, died. A line, a date, nothing more. No elegies, no volumes of remembrance. Her life, consumed by ritual, ended in ritual, and then was erased. As war spread, her memory dissolved further. The violence was apocalyptic. Entire villages wiped from maps. Fields burned, cities starved, churches desecrated. Historians estimate that 1/3 of the German population perished. In such a catastrophe, who would recall a sickly empress who left no heirs? The silence that followed Anna's death was not just neglect. It was obliteration by scale. And yet, the irony was bitter. Anna had spent her life embodying Catholic devotion, disciplining herself into a figure of ritual, a symbol of faith. But the very faith she embodied became weaponized in the war that followed her. Priests blessed armies, banners bore the Virgin's image, soldiers marched under the cross, while Anna's own story disappeared beneath the clash. Vienna itself shifted. Where once processions had carried her pale figure through cathedrals, now processions carried soldiers to war. Where bells once tolled for feast days, now they tolled for victories or defeats. The empire's gaze hardened, its memory narrowed. Anna's presence, once required at every liturgy, was no longer required at all. Matthias's own death in 1619 sealed her erasure. With him, the last link to her reign was gone. Ferdinand II's rise brought a new chapter of Habsburg history, one soaked in blood and defiance. Anna was not even a memory to be contested. She was simply absent. The contrast with other royal women of her time is stark. Some queens left heirs and were remembered through dynasties. Others involved themselves in politics, leaving trails in treaties and decrees. Anna left neither. Her devotion was her only mark, and devotion does not echo loudly in times of war. The cannons drowned her prayers. The fires erased her shadow. In monasteries, her name lingered faintly. At Kloster Neuburg, monks prayed for her soul as she had intended. But outside cloister walls, Europe bled and burned. Farmers buried children in shallow graves. Soldiers froze in forests. Plague followed famine. Against this backdrop, who would whisper the story of a queen who had coughed herself to death in a palace chamber? The brutality of war is not only measured in bodies, but in memory. The 30 Years' War devoured Anna's legacy as thoroughly as tuberculosis had devoured her lungs. She became one of countless silences, lives lost, names forgotten, stories erased not only by death, but by indifference. And yet, the war itself offers a cruel reflection of her fate. Like Anna, millions were sacrificed to ritual, not the ritual of court ceremony, but the ritual of ideology, banners, dogma. Just as she had been consumed by faith-driven obligation, so too was Europe consumed by faith-driven violence. Anna's personal tragedy became a symbol of a larger truth. In the Habsburg world, individuals were expendable, swallowed by systems greater than themselves. By the time peace finally arrived in 1648, 30 years after her death, Anna's name was gone from memory. New generations had risen, new rulers had reigned, new wars had scarred the land. She had been dead for as long as she had lived, and already she was a ghost no one spoke of. In the grand chronicles of the 30 Years' War, Anna of Tyrol does not appear. She is not there among the treaties, the campaigns, the shifting alliances. She had no influence, no voice. She is absent even in her own time. Forgotten not by accident, but by design. History had no place for her. Thus, the war, though not hers, became her final tomb. A tomb not of stone, but of silence. A silence that lasted for centuries, until her name was rediscovered only by historians searching footnotes, tracing the faint outlines of an empress erased. Today, when historians glance back at the House of Habsburg, the names that dominate are powerful ones: Charles V, Ferdinand II, Maria Theresa. Their decisions altered kingdoms. Their wars scarred generations. But somewhere behind those shadows lingers Anna of Tyrol, faint, almost invisible, yet strangely haunting once rediscovered. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What does history choose to remember? And, equally important, what does it choose to forget? Anna's life, when viewed through a modern lens, is a portrait of a woman consumed not by scandal or politics, but by silence. She was not assassinated like Empress Elizabeth centuries later, not overthrown like other queens, not remembered for great reforms or dramatic betrayals. Instead, she represents another form of tragedy: the quiet annihilation of self under the weight of ritual, devotion, and dynastic duty. For us, living centuries later, her suffering is legible in a new way. We can see in her pale face and relentless discipline the symptoms of a system that valued women primarily as vessels of lineage. She had no heir, and thus, by the standards of her time, she had no worth. That harsh equation reveals more about her society than about her. To the modern observer, Anna becomes a mirror for countless women silenced by history. Women who endured marriages not of choice but of politics. Women whose health was broken by endless ceremonies of expectation, whether in royal courts or village homes. Women erased from records because they left no children, no wars, no legacies that fit the official narratives. And yet, Anna also symbolizes endurance. She did not rebel, but she endured with a stoicism that almost defies comprehension. She continued to appear in ceremonies, even as disease hollowed her body. She continued to kneel in chapels, even as her lungs burned. There is a strength in that, though it is a tragic strength, the kind demanded by systems that give no space for refusal. Her monastery at Klosterneuburg is a reminder of that endurance. Standing today, it invites us not only to admire its architecture, but also to imagine the fragile Empress who insisted on its foundation. The monastery is more than stone. It is Anna's final act of agency, her attempt to leave behind something that could not be erased by silence. For modern eyes, that attempt is poignant. It shows that even in the narrow confines of her role, Anna reached for permanence. To read her story now is also to see the cruelty of how she was erased. Histories written in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War left no space for her. Even within Habsburg chronicles, she is reduced to a line: Anna, pious, childless. This reduction reveals how memory itself is shaped, not by truth, but by power. Her erasure was not simply the result of neglect, but of a conscious hierarchy of remembrance, where only those who furthered dynastic goals deserved to be recorded. Modern historians have begun to recover these forgotten voices, piecing together fragments from archives, letters, funeral records. In Anna's case, these fragments paint a picture not of triumph, but of humanity. A woman who prayed. A woman who coughed blood into linen. A woman who carried crowns too heavy for her fragile body. And perhaps, in a strange way, her very obscurity makes her relevant today. In an age when we question who has been silenced, who has been erased, Anna stands as a symbol of that silence. She was an empress, the highest title imaginable, and yet she vanished from memory. If even an empress could be forgotten, how many countless others have been lost entirely? To look back at Anna is to restore, however briefly, her humanity. It is to imagine her not as a line in a chronicle, but as a young woman from Innsbruck, raised in the chill of Tyrolean mountains, carrying fragile lungs into the grandeur of Vienna. It is to hear her cough echoing in the Habsburgs' cold chambers. It is to see her fingers trembling on a crucifix as candles flickered. It is to feel, across 4 centuries, the quiet tragedy of a life sacrificed to duty. Modern eyes cannot undo her fate. They cannot give her the heirs she lacked, the joy she was denied, the health she never had. But they can bear witness. They can resist her erasure by telling her story. In this way, Anna of Tyrol becomes not just a forgotten empress, but a reminder. History's silence is not inevitable. It is chosen. And what has been chosen can also be challenged. In remembering Anna, we also remember the millions of silenced lives like hers. Not queens, perhaps, but women bound by duty, erased by indifference, buried in silence. Anna's shadow stretches beyond Vienna, beyond the Habsburg dynasty. It becomes a symbol for all those who lived and died without being remembered. And so, In modern eyes, the forgotten empress becomes something more, a testament to the cost of invisibility and the fragile hope that memory, once lost, can still be reclaimed. Anna of Tyrol did not shape kingdoms. She did not leave heirs to carry her name. She did not carve her will into treaties or wars. Instead, she lived and died in the quiet margins of history, an empress whose greatest act was endurance. Her story reminds us that power is not only measured in crowns or armies. Sometimes, power is found in the fragile persistence of a single life. In Anna's case, that persistence was expressed in prayer, in ritual, in the determination to appear, even when her body begged her to rest. She gave herself fully, until nothing was left. History forgot her because she did not fit its terms of value. No children, no political triumphs. But to us, centuries later, her silence speaks. It tells us that countless lives, especially the lives of women, were consumed and erased, not because they lacked worth, but because the systems around them refused to see it. Standing today in Klosterneuburg, one can still feel her presence. The stone monastery endures, even if her memory nearly vanished. And in that endurance, she whispers that even the most forgotten lives matter, that even an empress erased by history deserves to be remembered. Anna of Tyrol's fate was unfortunate, but not meaningless. To tell her story now is to grant her what she was denied in life: a voice. And in that voice, we find a reminder that behind every crown lies a human heart, fragile and fleeting, longing simply to be seen.